No one in town could remember when the barbershop had first opened. By the spring of 1963, its beginnings had slipped beyond living memory, absorbed into the same quiet anonymity that shaped so much of black life on the East Side. Walker's barbershop sat halfway down Maple Street, a narrow commercial strip sustained almost entirely by black-owned businesses, 3 blocks from the railroad spur that fed the mills and warehouses. It lay close enough to downtown to feel its authority, its rules, its watchfulness, yet far enough away to share in neither its protection nor its prosperity. Inside the shop, time moved unevenly. Seasons were not marked by calendars, but by subtler signs. Heavy coats disappearing from wall hooks, replaced by lighter jackets. The air growing thicker as afternoons lengthened. The ceiling fan laboring uselessly against the heat. The space itself resisted change. The wooden sign above the door, once white, had faded into a chalked gray, its letters uneven where Earl Walker had repainted them by hand over the years, using whatever paint he could find. Still, everyone called it Walker's, as if the building drew its identity directly from the man who unlocked it each morning. The interior carried the same accumulated wear. The barber chairs, solid, metal-framed, bought second-hand decades earlier, had been patched and repatched, their vinyl split where repairs had failed. The mirrors bore permanent cloudy halos, etched by years of moisture and cleaning. Floorboards bowed slightly beneath each step, softened by generations of movement. Even before the lights came on, the shop announced itself by smell. Talcum powder, hair tonic, warm metal from clippers, and beneath it all the deep, persistent odor of old wooden fabric that no cleaning ever fully erased. Earl arrived just before 7 each morning, following a routine long practiced into his body. He walked from his house 3 blocks away, the key already separated in his pocket so he would not fumble at the door. He unlocked the shop, stepped inside, and paused before turning on the lights, allowing the room to acknowledge him before he altered it. He moved by instinct, his hand finding the broom without searching, his foot avoiding the loose board near the second chair. On cold mornings, he listened for the radiator's familiar hiss, though by the early 1960s it produced more sound than warmth. These motions required no thought. They were memory made physical. Earl had been cutting hair in that room since 1941. He had begun as a boy, apprenticed to an older barber whose hands eventually shook too much for straight razor work. When Earl took over, the country was already at war. Men left, returned changed, but did not return at all. Their absence settled quietly into the shop, leaving traces in worn chair arms, in names no longer spoken, in the silences that followed certain remarks. Earl sometimes felt that pieces of his own life had been deposited there as well, dispersed in hair clippings, dust, and the habitual paths his feet followed across the floor. The first customers arrived early, men heading to the mill before the whistle, others bound for the rail yard. They needed to look orderly even when the town offered little in return. Conversation stayed economical. Weather, rumors of overtime, prices that never stopped rising, news of relatives, an illness in Birmingham, a nephew drafted. Earl listened, nodded, adjusted the chair, and let the clippers hum. Hair fell. Time passed. Outside, Maple Street stirred as delivery trucks rattled by, and a school bus briefly released children's voices at the corner before moving on. Willie James began coming after school, usually a little out of breath, his shirt half untucked. He dropped his books on the bench before reaching for the broom. He had first arrived at 10, sent by his mother with exact change and a folded note. In those early years, he spoke little. Earl watched him grow, his voice lowering, shoulders broadening, confidence assembling itself in increments. Willie swept floors, wiped chairs, ran errands, and listened. Without ceremony, the barbershop became a second classroom. He learned how men spoke when they believed themselves unobserved, and he learned patience in a place where waiting accumulated as tangibly as hair on the floor. At home, Earl's life followed an equally measured rhythm. Lillian ran the household with practiced efficiency. They had been married long enough that conversation no longer depended on constant exchange. Their children passed through the house in brief surges of noise, then receded. Supper came at the same hour each evening. The radio played softly, music, then news. Earl listened without focus as headlines named places that still felt distant. Montgomery, Jackson, Atlanta. He read about bus boycotts, court rulings, injunctions, folded the paper, and moved on. History, as he understood it, happened somewhere else. The town itself operated by boundaries that needed no signs. Everyone knew where they could enter and where they could not. Downtown stores with rear doors. Lunch counters meant only to be seen through glass. Schools divided by lines never drawn on maps. Earl did not speak of these arrangements. He had learned early that survival depended on knowing when silence was safer than honesty. The shop stayed open because it was predictable, useful, and unthreatening. Haircuts were not political. Sweeping floors was not dangerous. He believed this with the certainty of someone who had seen trouble arrive without warning. The decision to buy a television came not from ambition, but from irritation. Customers complained about waiting. Younger men drifted toward newer shops. Radios no longer held attention. When a man from the mill mentioned selling his set, Earl hesitated. Televisions were expensive, conspicuous. They drew attention, but they also drew people. He told himself it was a practical choice. He carried the set in carefully, wrapped tight, his pulse uncomfortably quick. Inside the shop, it looked immediately wrong. Plastic edges clashing with wood worn smooth by decades. Earl adjusted the antennas, plugged it in, and left the screen dark. For days it sat untouched, neither acknowledged nor removed. When he finally turned it on one afternoon in late April, the sound startled him. The image wavered, then steadied. A street appeared, Birmingham, identified briefly by caption, crowded near a park he had never seen. Earl did not yet understand what he was watching, only that something in the room had shifted. Conversation stopped. Willie froze mid-sweep. The barbershop leaned toward the screen. Nothing dramatic followed. No police. No shouting. When the broadcast ended, Earl turned the set off. Haircuts resumed. Jokes returned. The day continued. And yet something had entered that could not be removed. That night, Earl lay awake listening to a train horn drift through the dark. He thought of the faces on the screen, of the date, April 1963, and of how close Birmingham suddenly felt. He told himself it was only television, only images. He did not yet understand that the barbershop had crossed a line no map had ever drawn. The television did not re-enter the barbershop with ceremony. After that first afternoon in late April 1963, it slipped into daily life the way dust did, gradually, without announcement, without asking permission. Some days Earl turned it on. Other days he left the screen dark, telling himself the choice still belonged to him, that he controlled when it spoke and when it remained silent. The men noticed patterns before he did. They began asking what time the news came on, timing their haircuts to coincide with evening broadcasts out of Birmingham and Montgomery. The bench along the wall filled earlier than before, knees now angled toward the television instead of toward one another. The shop, long held together by sound, voices, clippers, casual laughter, began instead to hold waiting. At first, the images felt distant enough to remain abstract. The cities named were familiar from headlines. Birmingham, Selma, Jackson. Their streets were wider than Maple Street, their parks framed by iron fencing and brick buildings unlike anything nearby. Earl worked with his eyes forward, letting the screen remain at the edge of his vision. He reminded himself that he had read about marches for years, listened to speeches on the radio just as long. But the television accomplished something print and sound had not. It showed faces. It lingered on the seconds before something happened and the seconds after, when people stood uncertain, deciding whether to move or wait. Those pauses carried weight. Willie absorbed the broadcasts with an intensity that unsettled Earl. He positioned himself closer than anyone else, sometimes crouching as though proximity might sharpen the image. When Earl told him to sweep or wipe a chair, Willie moved quickly, efficiently, his attention already drifting back to the screen. He began asking questions in fragments. How far Birmingham really was, whether people lost their jobs afterward, whether anything actually changed. Earl answered carefully, choosing words the way one chooses footing on unstable ground. As May approached, talk inside the shop sharpened. Leon Price spoke more often now, his voice steady, his scarred forearm resting on the chair arm, as if anchoring him. He spoke of dignity, of exhaustion with waiting. Others pushed back. Men with mortgages, with children nearing graduation, with jobs that existed only as long as no one drew attention. They spoke of consequences, of patience, of knowing how this town worked. Earl listened and kept cutting hair. He did not intervene. Each argument lodged somewhere behind his ribs, unresolved and accumulating. Outside, Maple Street registered the shift. People slowed as they passed the window. Some looked in openly. Others fixed their eyes elsewhere. The tailor next door mentioned, almost casually, that someone from the city had been asking questions about businesses along the block. Earl nodded and said nothing. After that, he began closing earlier. He kept the television volume low. He watched the mirrors more carefully now, tracking movement behind him. At home, Lillian sensed the change without explanation. Earl returned quieter, lingering at the table after supper, leaving the newspaper folded. One evening, she asked whether buying the television had been a mistake. Earl thought of the empty evenings before it arrived, of the safety that had once felt indistinguishable from smallness. He told her he did not know. She accepted the answer without pressing. The tone of the reports shifted during the first week of May. Stories arrived closer together. Sit-ins were followed by arrests. Court orders were mentioned briefly, without emphasis. Earl noticed how often the word peaceful was repeated, as if aimed at someone not watching. Then, on May 3rd, the images changed again. The screen filled with young people. Teenagers, Earl realized. Students. Their clothing was plain, their expressions disciplined in a way that looked learned. Among them were smaller bodies, children young enough that fear had not yet learned restraint. Willie leaned so close that Earl snapped at him to step back, his voice sharper than intended. Willie complied at once, his hands trembling at his sides. The fire hoses appeared without warning. Bodies lifted and slid across pavement near a park Earl had never visited. The sound filled the barbershop, hollow, relentless. Someone cursed under his breath. Someone else turned away. Earl felt his stomach tighten. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This was not chaos. It was control, applied deliberately and without hesitation. That night, the radio felt thin. Earl listened anyway as the announcer, voice level, described arrests, dogs, children. Lillian moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to interrupt. Across town, Willie lay awake, replaying the images until they blurred together. For the first time, distance no longer offered protection. Birmingham was only a few hours away, close enough to imagine the heat rising off the pavement, the smell of water and fear. 3 days later, a flyer appeared on the barbershop counter, placed neatly, as if it belonged there. It announced a meeting at Pine Street Baptist Church on Thursday evening for prayer and discussion. Earl found it when he opened the register. He folded it slowly, slid it into his pocket, and spent the morning distracted, missing details he had never missed before. He nicked a customer's ear and apologized more than necessary. That Thursday, Earl walked to the church alone. The sanctuary was already full. He recognized faces from the shop, from Maple Street, from years of shared space that had never quite required shared purpose. The pastor spoke carefully, referencing Birmingham indirectly at first, then by name. History, he said, was not waiting for permission. Earl sat with his hands clasped, the folded flyer damp with sweat in his pocket. When volunteers were asked to stand, Willie's hand rose before Earl fully understood what he was seeing. The boy stood straight, his face pale but steady. His name was written down without comment. Fear moved through Earl quickly and without ceremony. He remained seated. The weight of that decision settled into him, dense and unmoving. Walking home afterward, Earl understood something he had resisted for weeks. The television had not brought Birmingham into the barbershop. It had only made visible what was already moving toward them. The line the shop had crossed could not be crossed again in the opposite direction. The planning did not announce itself with speeches or certainty. It emerged quietly, after long workdays ended, in borrowed rooms and church basements where people arrived in pairs or small groups to avoid attention. Pine Street Baptist Church became a place not only of prayer, but of whispered logistics. Folding chairs scraped softly across concrete floors. Names were written down, crossed out, written again. Routes were proposed, then altered when someone mentioned a patrol pattern, a hostile storefront owner, or a stretch of street that could not be trusted at certain hours. Earl attended more of these meetings than he later admitted to Lillian, always positioning himself near the back, telling himself he was there only to listen. Each time, his attention returned to Willie, seated among the younger volunteers, absorbing instructions with a seriousness that tightened something in Earl's chest. By mid-May 1963, Birmingham dominated the news. Newspapers carried photographs dated May 7th and May 10th. Police dogs straining at leashes, children pressed against the sides of patrol wagons. On the barbershop television, Earl watched brief footage of Dr. King, his remarks cut short when the local station abruptly returned to regular programming. No one commented. The meeting required no explanation. Events were accelerating, whether anyone felt prepared or not. Willie committed himself to the work with quiet intensity. He distributed leaflets printed on thin paper that blurred when rain fell. He memorized meeting times and locations. He learned which doors were safe to knock on, which streets invited questions, which could be crossed without comment, and which could not. He stayed out later, returning home with his voice hoarse and his shoes coated in red dust from long walks. His mother noticed immediately. She asked little, but her gaze lingered, as if fixing his features in memory against some future absence. Willie registered her concern without letting it slow him. The images from Birmingham remained fixed in his mind. The water, the dogs, the fact that fear had not halted motion. Inside the barbershop, conversation shifted from whether something should be done to how it might be done. Some men spoke of a local march, smaller and quieter than Birmingham's, meant to test the ground rather than claim it. Others warned that this town was not Birmingham, that its police were not constrained by national attention or federal scrutiny. Earl listened as the room filled with a nervous, contained energy. Without intending to, he had become the keeper of a space where decisions were rehearsed aloud. The patrol car began stopping outright. One afternoon it parked across the street, an officer leaning against the hood, arms folded, watching through the window while Earl cut hair with deliberate steadiness. No words were exchanged. None were needed. After the car drove off, the shop remained silent. When Earl finally set the clippers down, his hands were shaking. At home, Lillian addressed it directly. What would happen if Willie were arrested? If someone were hurt? If the shop were closed? Earl had no answers that could satisfy her. He said only that pretending nothing was happening no longer felt possible. Lillian replied quietly that possibility had never been distributed evenly to begin with. They sat together in the dim kitchen long after the radio went silent, the night pressing close. A date was chosen, a Tuesday in late May. The route was modest, from Pine Street Baptist Church to the county courthouse, less than a mile. No signs, no chanting. Walk, stop, stand, disperse. Earl listened as the streets were named, streets he knew by habit, by decades of routine. He pictured the line of march-passing storefronts that would lock their doors as it approached. The night before, Willie slept little. He lay awake listening to the house settle, to his sister's breathing, to his mother's footsteps moving softly down the hall. He thought of the bruise he might carry home, the trouble he might cause. He thought again of Birmingham, of boys younger than himself standing against water hoses. Before dawn, he dressed quietly and left a note on the table stating only that he loved them. Earl opened the barbershop as usual that morning. He swept the floor, turned on the lights, brewed coffee he did not drink. The television was already on, carrying a bright comedy program, recorded laughter spilling into the room with an inappropriateness that felt almost deliberate. Willie entered just before 10. He paused at the counter and met Earl's eyes. Earl saw fear there, but also resolve. He nodded once. Willie nodded back and stepped out onto the street. The march assembled quickly. Fewer people than Willie had hoped for, more than he had expected. They lined up unevenly, shoulders brushing, the late May heat already pressing down. When they began to walk, the movement felt almost ordinary, reduced to footsteps and breath. Willie fixed his eyes on the back of the person ahead of him and did not look toward the sidewalks. They were stopped 2 blocks from the courthouse. Police cars blocked the street, officers standing shoulder to shoulder. Words were exchanged, measured at first, then sharper. Willie felt a hand clamp around his arm. He stumbled and fell, the air driven from his lungs as his cheeks struck pavement. The surface burned. He tasted dust. A boot passed close enough for him to notice the scuff on the leather. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the pressure eased. He was pulled up, shoved aside, warned, and released. The group dispersed quickly. No one ran. No one lingered. Willie walked home alone, his arm already darkening beneath his sleeve. He felt shaken and hollowed, and unexpectedly steady. The march had not transformed the town. It had scarcely interrupted the day. Yet something within him had shifted and did not return to its former place. At the barbershop, Earl waited. He cut no hair. He watched the door. Information arrived slowly, passing remarks, a brief radio mention late that afternoon. No mass arrests. No serious injuries. A warning delivered and received. Earl closed early and leaned against the locked door, letting the weight of the day settle fully into his body. That evening, Willie returned home with his shirt torn and his arm bruised. His mother held him longer than usual, said nothing, and returned to the stove. They ate in silence. Later, Willie lay awake replaying the fall and the realization that no one was coming to rescue him. He did not feel regret. He felt older. In the days that followed, the town absorbed the event quietly. Some praised the marchers. Others insisted they had invited trouble. Police presence increased. The barbershop emptied, then slowly filled again, though nothing regained its former ease. Earl found himself watching the door more often, alert to every sound from the street. He understood, then, that neutrality had always been an illusion. The television had not created what had happened. It had revealed it. The barbershop had not become political. It had simply stopped pretending it existed outside history. After the march, nothing publicly announced that the town had changed, and it was this absence that unsettled Earl more than open retaliation ever could have. No emergency ordinances appeared on courthouse doors. No speeches were delivered from the steps. June 1963 arrived quietly, bringing heat and the familiar routines of work, church, and errands. The streets resumed their patterns with a speed that felt almost intentional, as if repetition itself were being used to erase interruption. The patrol car continued to circle Maple Street, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, its presence neither explained nor withdrawn. What remained was not spectacle, but residue, thin and persistent, settling into conversations and silences, altering them just enough to be felt. The barbershop reopened the next morning. Earl unlocked the door and paused as he always did, but the quiet inside had changed. It now carried memory. He swept the floor, feeling the familiar softness of the boards beneath the broom, though the motion demanded more attention than it once had. Customers returned cautiously, then more steadily. Some spoke of the march with pride. Others dismissed it as reckless. Earl listened and cut hair, offering little in return, his attention drifting more often to the window and the door. Willie came back 2 days later. He swept without being asked, careful with his arm where the bruise had begun to yellow. He did not volunteer details. When questioned directly, he answered plainly, without emphasis. Earl noticed that Willie no longer reacted sharply to the television, even when the news carried images from other southern cities. He stood farther back now, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. Something in him had settled, a gravity Earl recognized. At home, Willie's mother watched him with quiet vigilance. She did not forbid meetings or scold him for late nights. Instead, she cooked more, folded his clothes with deliberate care, and placed food before him even when he claimed not to be hungry. Willie accepted these gestures without comment. He understood that fear could be a form of love, and that silence often carried more meaning than words. The television remained in the barber shop, not a provocation now, but a fixture, a window. Earl turned it on less often, but when he did, no one treated it as background noise. On June 11th, the president's address filled the screen, framing civil rights as a moral question rather than a regional dispute. When the speech ended and a commercial followed without pause, Earl reached out and turned the set off before the jingle could begin. The transition felt indecent. Business stabilized without returning to what it had been. A few men never came back. Others appeared for the first time, drawn perhaps by rumor, perhaps by the sense that the shop had become a place where certain truths could be spoken aloud. Earl did not ask. He accepted whoever sat in his chair, adjusted the height, draped the cloth, and worked. Routine mattered more now. It was what held the days together. Lillian noticed the change in Earl, even when he tried to hide it. He came home tired in a way rest did not correct. He listened more than he spoke. One evening, she asked whether he regretted buying the television. Earl thought of the first flicker of light in April, of Birmingham, of Willie's raised hand. He said no, not because the consequences had been light, but because regret assumed an alternative that still felt available. Lillian nodded. She understood. Summer deepened. News arrived unevenly. An assassination in Mississippi, protests spreading, court orders issued and ignored. On Maple Street, change came quietly. A sign disappeared from a public building one morning. A policy bent without announcement. Life advanced through accumulation rather than declaration. One evening near the end of August, Earl closed later than usual. The low sun slanted through the front window, catching dust in the air. Willie finished sweeping and paused by the door, watching the street. Earl turned the television on by habit, then turned it off just as automatically when a bulletin interrupted the program. He did not need to see it. He recognized the pattern now. After Willie left, Earl remained alone in the shop. He ran his hand along the backs of the chairs, feeling grooves worn by decades of use. He thought of the men who had sat there before him, of conversations that had filled the room and vanished, of moments that had seemed small at the time and decisive only later. He understood, then, that the barbershop had never existed outside history. It had always been one of the places where history arrived quietly, through routine, through objects, through decisions that felt personal until they were not. Evening settled over Maple Street. Somewhere a radio played. A train horn sounded in the distance. Willie walked home at an unhurried pace, his future uncertain but no longer unimaginable. Earl locked the door and slipped the key into his pocket, the same pocket where the flyer from Pine Street Baptist Church had once rested, damp with sweat. He felt the weight of the day ease, not into relief, but into acceptance. The television sat dark in the corner, its screen reflecting the room back at itself. Earl did not look away. He understood now that some images, once seen, did not fade, and that the measure of a life was found not in moments that announced themselves loudly, but in the quiet decisions made in familiar rooms on ordinary days when the world asked, without warning, where one would stand. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.